Kwe, hello, bonjour tout le monde. Thank you to everyone who is joining us in person here at la Maison de la littérature, and welcome to those of you who are streaming online on Facebook as part of the Salon du Livre des Premières Nations. It is my honor to introduce Angela to the audience. We're going to be talking about her new book, Unbroken, My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls. So this is the book we're going to be talking about this morning. But before we get into that conversation, we have some people to thank. This activity is offered by Quebec and la Maison de la littérature as part of the 12th edition of the First Nations Book Fair. A TELUS presentation in collaboration with the CN interjects renewable energy, Hydro-Québec, and the Caisse des Jardins de Wendake, and OKT Law. Produced by Quebec, the 2023 edition is made possible thanks to the financial support of the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of Canada, the Government of Quebec, the SODEC, and the CDFM Huron-Wendat. Angela Sterritt is an award-winning investigative journalist and national best-selling author from Wiik'aax of the Gitanmaax community within the Gitxsan Nation on her father's side, and from Bell Island, Newfoundland on her mother's side. Sterritt has worked in television. You may know her from some of her reports in radio, television. She was worked for CBC for more than a decade and has recently left. She hosted the award-winning CBC original podcast, Land Back, investigating land theft and land reclamation in Canada. And she lives on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Her book, Unbroken, a work that is part memoir and part investigation into the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls, published by Greystone Books, became an instant bestseller in May of 2023. So the book is still in its infancy stage, so it's really great that we get to talk about it together today. It is now nominated for the prestigious Hilary Weston Writers' Trust Award for Best Nonfiction Book in Canada, and you may have also spotted it on the shortlist for the Governor General's Literary Awards in the category of nonfiction. Without further ado, welcome to Angela. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to sit. I don't think we've ever met.
We've never met.
Just on social media maybe, but I'm super excited, and I'm very congratulations for being awarded the Massey Fellowship. I did that as well, and it was such a great space to get out of the news cycle and kind of see the trees. What is it? Is it see the forest instead of just chopping down the trees? And I love how they encourage you not to think about journalism at all. Yeah, so congratulations. It's a huge win. It's a very competitive
Thank you,
fellowship.
Angela. I'm the one usually throwing flowers at the start of the conversation. And I wanted to congratulate you on your book. And I should also underline to people that I believe you were the first Indigenous journalist, Indigenous woman journalist.
I think it was first known First Nations person. Wow. I always say first known because you never know, right? Yes. But that's what I was told, yeah.
Yes. So we share a lot in common in terms of the work. We've both worked for CBC for over a decade in different roles, behind the scenes, in front of the camera, in my case, in front of the microphone. And we're going to talk about media today, but I wanted to talk first about some of the really important choices you made in Unbroken. And I wanted to talk about language and your choice to use the Gitxsan language as the title of each chapter, as well as peppered through your own stories where you use the Gitxsan word and then you give us the English equivalent. Why was that choice important in writing your story?
That honestly is one of the most important questions I think people can ask, because I think maybe 10 years ago, I remember a couple people were talking about, is it really possible to decolonize institutions? Is it really possible to decolonize the media? And I said, well, yes, but if you look at it on a spectrum, right, from completely colonized to decolonized, what would that look like? We're speaking English right now. Decolonize would be, we're speaking our own languages. When I reported in Yellowknife, we broadcast in 9 Indigenous languages. But even then, I think there was definitely this sense of lesser than in the newsroom, like, oh, those are just the Indigenous language shows over there, or that's just the Indigenous story. This was 2013. A lot has changed since then, right? In particular, the amplification of Indigenous stories. But I think, so every chapter is in a language that represents what that chapter is. So many are Gitxsan. And then there's one that is about Tamara Chipman, so she's Wet'suwet'en. There's a chapter about Newhalk, so that's in Newhalk. And it was really, really hard. My podcast as well, I was like, if we're talking about land back, we need to talk about the Indigenous land within their lens. And that might mean something very different. Like, this is when we get into decolonizing, right? So like they'll have words that mean movement around, right? Not like what we think, like, oh, a beautiful killer whale, or, you know, this romantic, you know, vision of indigeneity that we think of as, you know, I'm also part white, so as like a colonized white person, also an Indigenous person. But I think for me, this book, it was really important to me and my editor to make sure that we decolonized it as much as possible and had that representation. And that's a lot of work. That wasn't easy. That was like sometimes researching with 5 different elders for one word. Yeah, so when you're doing that work of decolonizing is incredibly difficult.
5 different elders in some cases.
Yep.
I'm glad you brought up decolonizing, and then you also just used the term indigeneity and indigenizing. In part of the thank yous at the end of the book, you thank, there's one woman in particular, Jennifer, I believe, who you thank for, I can pull it up since I have the book right in front of me, in the acknowledgement section. To my editor, Jennifer Kroll, who witnessed the struggles it took to get this work to publication, advocated for my success and wellness. And then you also shout out Dawn Lowen, who showed me what being decolonized in heart and mind looks like, and who you credit with making your writing stronger. Can you tell us a bit about Dawn and Jennifer and the other people?
No one's ever asked me that before. That actually just kind of made me emotional, because I just imagine, I haven't read that for so long, and I just imagine they read it and they probably felt so good about themselves. So Jennifer is a white woman, and I will just say off, like, so my book went through a competitive auction. So there were big publishers wanting to take on the book, buy the book, and, you know, we're saying things like, totally into this as long as you take out all the missing and murdered Indigenous women's cases. Stuff like that, or just like not getting it. Like I totally understand about residential school, and I'm like, my book isn't about that. And so when I went for the meeting with Greystone, immediately they were like, we know this isn't trauma porn, we know this is about justice, we know this is about your story. Like they just immediately got it. And there were learning curves though, right? I go through learning curves, we all do. But the difference, I think, from someone who goes through those learning curves with open eyes and an open heart and someone who is defensive, that makes a big difference in the trajectory of change and evolution that's going to happen. And so I always think about one instance where I was like, oh, this is so interesting, because Jen was incredibly open-minded and well-read and understood colonial violence. Like, we didn't have to teach her a lot, like, you know, exhaust myself educating her. But there were a couple things like, so for Indigenous people, when we talk about supernatural beings, we're talking about the double-headed serpent. We're talking about the thunderbird on the mountain. That's what supernatural means to us. And so she was like, oh, just so you know, like supernatural actually means like ghosts and paranormal activity. And I'm like, no. And I'm like, okay, we're gonna have to go through some things here. And she was just like, okay, yeah. You know, there was no, and that's the difference, I think, with CBC, and we can talk about that more. But there's this layer of like, nope, we know what's best, and you are outside of that norm, and you need to assimilate to us. Whereas Jen was sort of, it wasn't about assimilation, it was about learning. and me kind of having to hold steadfast and go like, no, this is important. And then Dawn too, that was very interesting because there were a couple times where she was like, hey, I've just copy edited this Gitxsan book, and they actually say the plural for Wilps, which is our house group. My house group is the House of the Big Wings, Wiik'aax. And she's like, they say, what is it? I say Wilps, but that was incorrect. So she corrected me, and I'm like, that's amazing. And it's not, it could have been like, you're telling me what it is, but she's like, no, I'm not doing that at all, but I did just edit this Gitniao book, and it was really an example of reciprocity and relationship between Indigenous and white people in a way that worked. And the self-care piece, having my book finished, going on all these book events, the lineup, like the signing the books, like everything can be traumatic. And one of the things they did was they said, we've got this fund for you to get some like mental health coaching around the book. And I'm like, you care about me, and I've never had that in my career as a journalist ever. And they had to sustain a lot of obstacles along the way. Yeah.
Angela, I'm still just struck by what you just said about the idea that an editor, for anyone who's flipped through the book or read the book already, the idea that you could even possibly take out the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women from that book, it would be a completely different book. And it seems like that would be just your own story, but in the book you see how interwoven it is with those women and their families and the people who've survived incredible violence. You mentioned your house, and I think a lot of people would love to know more about a story you actually shared with the people who were here yesterday, the name that you were given just around the same time as you made a big career change.
Yeah, and just to riff off the last point that you said too, I think, do you know who Cease Rosner is? He's an investigative journalist at CBC. Well, he's not just an investigative journalist, he was like running the CBC for a while, and now he's writing his second or third book. And he was such an amazing person throughout my career. There were times when I would like have stories pulled off air and I'd be like, cease, help, and he'd be like, what's going on? And put that back on air. So amazing. And I remember I went into his office and I was like, I want to write a book that is part investigative journalism and part memoir. And everyone who I told about that idea were just like, that's really weird. Like they'd look at me like I had three heads and they'd be like, I don't know about this. Like I think you need to pick one. And he was just like, well, I think it can be done. And there was one example that he gave me at the time. And it's really about carving your own path, I think, as an author, right? And really going outside the norms. And I was just thinking about this last night. So in our culture, we have like a transformational trickster figure named Wiik'aax. And what he does, he's like a very mischievous character, and he'll just fuck with stuff but like create stuff out of that. And what it teaches us is you never should accept anything as norm because things are ever changing in nature. And as humans, we just want to hold on to the norm so bad, like we want to keep that going. But as good as something is, we need to learn how to let it go because it needs to transform and evolve. So he's always teaching us nothing can ever become a norm. So yeah, that was just a very, I had to take a very different turn on what, modern day literature is. So in our culture, we have house groups called Wilps. Wilps is the plural. And so my grandfather, Walter Sterritt, was groomed his entire young boy and man life to be the hereditary chief of Wiik'aax, the House of the Big Wings. People would bring him gifts, like he was being groomed for this role. He decided not to take that on because it's huge in modern day context. It's like a lot of money, it's a lot of resources, it's a lot. And so my uncle, Neil Sterritt, took that role on. Our culture is matrilineal, so that means myself, having a white mom, in order to be accepted legally by that house group and by my clan, Lakibu Wolf Clan, you need to be adopted by a high-ranking member of your house group or by an auntie or a female. And so before that process was happening, I was learning my language, and everyone was introducing themselves by way of their house group and their clan, and I didn't have that. And I was like, oh my God, this is so intimidating. What do I do? And my elder, who's also my cousin, who's also a doctor, Dr. Jane Smith, Chuis, our language teacher, I said, what do I do? And she said, well, we'll give you an honorary Gitxsan name. You can go by your grandfather's house group for now. And so I'm on my way actually to quit my job. I told my boss, I'm quitting CBC, I'm done. And she's like, please, she was crying. She's like, please don't go. We will do anything to keep you, anything. And she's bawling, and I'm like, thank you, but like, no, like I have to go. But I'll go for coffee with you just to wrap things up. So as I'm on my way to quit my job as a television and radio reporter, I get this email from my language teacher, and she says, your Gitxsan name will be Lualgia Tumpist, which means woman who works in television and radio. And I just thought, oh, that's funny. I didn't end up quitting that day. My boss ended up luring me back in, but I did quit like a few months later. So it's been a month free of CBC now. It's been very good. Take a deep breath. And then I was legally recognized by my house group on June 21st. And so I am legally Lualgia Tumpist. I don't know how that's going to fit into my life. Woman who works in television. Maybe I'll be Oprah, the Indigenous Oprah later. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. But yeah, so I'm no longer with CBC, and now I'm a legal member of my house group in Gitxsan Nation.
Change, a big year of change for
yeah.
you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
On both of those accomplishments. It's a big decision, it's a big change.
Yeah.
And it's something, as a journalist reading your book, not knowing that you had left CBC yet, there were many questions that jumped out at me, especially the pages and pages of notes that you have diligently annotated. And the journalist in me was wondering, is that pressure you put on yourself to have a source for every kind of claim you are making in this book? Was that outside pressure? Was that pressure you were putting on yourself? Why was it so important to be so diligent in terms of the notes, the index, the acknowledgements, the thank yous to all of the families of the missing and murdered Indigenous girls, the choice to name those women and girls? Were those outside pressures you put on yourself?
Yeah, that's another really great question that no one's ever asked me. So I think being an Indigenous journalist, there's kind of like a couple of different pressures that are put on you. Like there's the pressure from CBC, like stay in your lane. You're not good. Like as Indigenous people, like I always tell my son, I'm like, you're Indigenous. You need to work 5 times as hard as anybody because you'll always be the lazy, dirty Indian. Always. You'll always be. Before I left my job, I think a week before I left my job, I was still being questioned by these 2 younger white men. Like, does Angela even know what she's talking about here? Does Angela even have it right? Because it was not an Indigenous story. And so I'm always told, stay in your lane, you don't know journalism. I've won way more awards than any of them, and still questioned, right? So there's that. Then there's the reality of being an Indigenous journalist and being considered biased for reporting on Indigenous communities, even if they're thousands of kilometers away from my own, completely distinct. It's this notion that we're all of homogenous, right? If you go to Yellowknife, it's incredibly different. They're like a very different system. But always having that, like, oh, I'm going to be considered biased. I'm going to be considered like on the take somehow, right? Because I'm trauma informed, or because I care, or just because I'm Indigenous, period. But then the third piece is wanting to get it right and having a level of accountability to not just my own Gitxsan community, but all of those Indigenous communities across the land. And I remember somebody being like, you're like the only journalist that we trust. And I kept on hearing this over and over again, in particular when it came to MMIWG, and I was like, I'm not really doing much different. Like there was a couple things that I would say, like, you don't need to tell me the details because I've got the parole documents, like I've got all the documents, so you don't have to worry about that. If you need to stop, you can stop. You can cancel the interview. Kind of no-nos in journalism, but I was like, that's all I'm really doing. And I remember I came across an interview on Dalit. That's like the system that we use, the audio system in the booth. And I was like, oh, this is how I'm different. It was just like, yeah, you've been to residential school. Yeah, okay. Let's just get to the point. Or like, was it really that bad? Are you telling the truth? And then lots of like, how much alcohol did you really drink? Oh, you've been sober for 7 years. You don't even have a beer. Like a lot of really nefariously racist tones and questions, like horrifying. There was one piece of tape that I actually turned over to CBC, and I was like, this is not right. This is so harmful that I'm shocked. Like one day you're gonna get sued for this, and they ended up like letting me redo the interview actually. But the level of accountability I feel to other Indigenous communities, even in there's in my podcast there's. And there's some of this in my book as well on Squamish people in Vancouver, that's the Squamish territories. And there's a little bit of dispute about if this woman's a hereditary chief or not. And so how do I navigate that? I don't want, and everyone in the community was like, we don't want to disrespect her, but she's not the hereditary chief, but she kind of is. And I'm like, holy fuck, this is very confusing. And so having to tread those roads softly, right? Or like 3 different people are like telling me 3 completely different points of view on something, and so treading that. So for me, that's more important than anything, is getting that right? And a lot of Indigenous people aren't going to tell you, right? So you're just going to have to feel it. You're just going to make sure you get it right, you know? People aren't going to pull you aside and be like, you got it wrong. They're just going to probably talk about it with each other, but I don't know. But so that was really important to me was, and to be honest, before CBC even looked at Unbroken, that fact check, it's very uncommon in books. I didn't know that until I had a meeting with my agent 2 days ago.
The level of fact checking?
Yeah.
That you experience in this book. And I was even struck by in the thank yous you say, thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts for funding the writing and fact-checking of
so
this
that was
book.
Jen Kroll, my editor's idea. She was like, why don't we pay somebody outside to fact-check? Because this is so heavy. And she caught so much.
And that's a very cumbersome process.
So cumbersome.
It's very time-consuming. I know so many people whose books came out later than they would have wanted because of how long that process has to take if you're doing it properly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always that way. Yeah.
Do you want to share more about some of the challenges that came up with
Do
your
you guys
employer?
want me to drop a bomb?
Spill the tea, please.
Do you want me to drop a bomb? Do you want me to drop a bomb? Okay, so I haven't said this publicly before, probably because I was afraid I could have got fired, but I can't get fired now. But so for CBC, books need to be approved by them. If you don't go through the approval process, you can get fired, which happened. So Richard Zussman, he was the best reporter in our newsroom, a white guy. He worked at the legislature building, did all the BC politics, the best reporter, for sure. He did the most stories. I was like, how do you even have a toddler right now? Just doing so much. And he was fired, and we were like, what the hell? And I saw him after that, and I was like, and he was like, literally, it was just because my book wasn't approved. And I had asked.
And what was his book about?
The BC legislature.
Okay.
It was about BC politics.
So because it was based on some of the work that he might have done for CBC, CBC needed to just give it the green light and be like, this represents our journalism in a good way?
And I was told it could have been, sorry, this is really, I don't know if this is boring or intriguing, but I was told that it might have been that CBC was upset that he didn't break those stories through CBC. They were broken in the book. So it was a propriety?
Yeah.
Am I saying that right? Propriety. Like a competitive issue of ownership. Yeah. So that's a real fear. Like people were like, holy fuck, like so terrified after that. There was the Gomeshi effect, and then there was the Peter Mansbridge effect, which is like we can't do outside speaking gigs, and then there was the Richard Zussman effect. And so I had to get approval to write my book. I had every step of the way it had to be approved by CBC. So when it was done, they had to approve the journalism within it. And so through a secret committee, I'm not making this up, it was decided my book was not approved in the form it is now, because it didn't stand up to their journalistic standards and practices. And one of the main reasons why was that they believed that the fact that Indigenous women, that I say in my book, Indigenous women and white women are not treated the same by media, they didn't believe that was a proven fact. So my book was canceled. And that was why my book was delayed for several months. And on top of many, many, many other things. But it was not accepted in the form that it is in now. We fought and fought and fought. I think there was 10 changes. Anytime you see in the book, CBC commented that was something they didn't agree with. Anytime I said white reporter, they were very upset about that. They were like, you can't call them a white reporter. You must just call them reporter. And I'm like, well, the context is everything. Yeah, it was very traumatizing. Yeah, it's one of the main reasons I left.
You're so generous in the book with what you show of all of the steps that you had to take to be able to tell these stories to a standard that reflects your standards as a journalist, but also as an Indigenous woman, as a survivor. You talked about how you've been on the road basically nonstop since this book came out. You worked so hard and for so long on this book. What has it been like to be in front of audiences, to be signing those books? You talked about the support that you need for some of that more heavier work. But what has it been like to be traveling across Canada and parts of the US already, across Turtle Island, sharing this book?
That was really interesting going to the States because I thought, oh, this is going to be so cute. Like, no one knows who I am. And it was standing room only. People were fighting to get in. This guy at the door was like, I don't know who your fans are, but they're crazy. Like, they're verging on violence.
You needed a bouncer for a book launch?
That's what he said. He's like, that was intense. So, yeah, it's been amazing. It's everywhere I go in, like, North America, every city has, like, a different pulse. It is writing books is a very white thing to do. So I feel like even, I got this my first stop on the book tour was in a prison. And most of the community there were white women, and I brought a prison advocate with me. They didn't know that, but I was like, I'm bringing this friend, and they were like, yeah, cool. And she was like, where's all the Indigenous women? Because we know there's an overrepresentation in prison of Indigenous women. And I was like, yeah. And so she's like, oh, they're all in there sewing ribbon skirts. And I'm like, oh, okay. And she's like, writing books is so white. I'm like, it is. And so most of the audience is, I would say, 90% white women. And so I think sometimes navigating a little bit of that and understanding it's very different because it's different. It's holding space for a very different vibe than I'm used to. And it's been a whole journey. So I think at first I was very energetically overwhelmed by, sometimes people come up to me in the book line crying and I'm so sorry this happened to you. And I'm like, whoa. So it's been a lot of and now just hold okay, this person wants to talk about this and that's okay, I need to hold space for them. So it's been a whole energetic transformation of understanding and coming to terms with the reality that I know a lot of Indigenous people are like, oh, don't be shocked this happened to us. And I'm like, be shocked. Yeah. You're just learning about this too. We lived through this. We lived on reserves. Yeah. We lived through residential school. We lived through the foster care system. We lived through extreme racism to this day in 2023. But you don't. And you're just hearing about this. And it should be, I think it should be shocking. I think it should be upsetting. So for me having to be okay, they need to have the space as well has been like a journey for me, and not something I think every Indigenous person, but I think I'm also part white, right? On my mom's side and my dad's side. So I'm thinking about like, okay, well, what's going on for that? And yeah, just navigating, right? Not exhausting my energy.
Yeah.
That's a whole thing.
I want to read one of the lines in your book that kept coming back for me as I was reading it, and this is in your voice. For years, navigating the trauma in my life, from the abuse I experienced at home to street life entrenched in unpredictability to violence in relationships, I found that I was not the only one who bore scars from the shrapnel of colonization. Far from it. Bearing scars from the shrapnel of colonization, and then showing those scars, revealing those scars, and saying, you're not alone, this is my story. And you also talk so much throughout about the people who helped guide you and how much of your story you felt comfortable sharing, wanting to name people, respecting other people's privacy when you're telling your own story, and that's a big challenge. But I want to talk about that image of the shrapnel of colonization a little bit. What went into that choice, that wording, that imagery?
I think we hear a lot about intergenerational trauma. I think people are understanding and cognizant of what that is now, and that's really important. But I think, speaking as a part white woman now, I think we also need to think about the shrapnel being the intergenerational racism that is so heavily ingrained in us today, in the way that we normalize racism, as subtle as it may be, in institutions, the way we normalize the thinking in our brain. When I was in that prison, it was really interesting because it was all white. I think there was 2 Indigenous women, but all the white women were like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not racist at all. I don't see color, someone said. And I said, well, it's not, I'm not talking about like, and this isn't a prison. And like, how, or most people should know how segregated prisons are in terms of race. And I said, well, it's not what you're saying, it's not maybe how you're behaving, it's not how you're treating people, it's the thoughts that go through your mind, because thoughts become things. And I think people don't understand that shrapnel of colonization, how it lives. So I always talk about this example in my newsroom, where this is subtle but also very extreme. So you're sitting in a newsroom, and people might identify this within their institutions as well, because people are always like, what can I do? What can I do? And I'm like, speak out. I'm so tired of being the only one. I'm so tired. So you're sitting in a newsroom in a pitch meeting, and we're pitching for the morning show, like what should be the top story, what should we put on at 5 a.m., at 6 a.m., at 7 a.m. Our show starts at 4:30. It was like ridiculous, horrendous. And so you're sitting around a table, and there's like maybe 22 people, well, maybe like 12 actually, I'll say 12, sometimes 22, and there's lots of casuals. Say 12 people around a room. I'm the only Indigenous woman. Maybe there's one other time in my life where I wasn't. The only Indigenous person, and maybe there are like 2 other people of color. And they're going around saying what the top stories are, and there's a lot of confidence among the white people. And they're like, the top story for me today is my 2 children can't get swimming lessons at the same time. And everyone's like, yes, me too. Oh my God, that community. Yes, and that you eat at that. Yeah, we all do the same thing. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, this is heinous. And I'm like, so there's a lack of clean drinking water and I'm kind of like insecure already, right? Outnumbered. And I'm like, there's no clean drinking water in this community right now. Like, this is 2022. And they're like, that's really important, but it sounds a little bit too complicated for us, and it sounds like it's probably not our top story. And you just kind of shrink, right? And you're told over and over and over and over and over again that you don't belong in that room, period. I will say people have asked me, what changed things? So when I have that situation, or when I have my boss say, can we just talk about you using the word white person in your podcast? And me being like, well, they are white. And she's like, well, you wouldn't call them black people. I'm like, no, I would not. And, me and my colleagues being like, what is happening? And me going on Twitter and saying, hey, everybody, what do white people want to be called? Right? And 50,000 people writing, white people, or what's the top story today? Lack of clean drinking water, and them going, oh my God, did you see 50,000 people are, so when you work in these institutions, those 12 people can have so much power, so much more power than the public they claim to represent. So when that public has a voice, whether it's through social media, whether it's through reading stories, the metrics on our stories tell a lot, then we start to see change. But often we don't. Often we're okay with being the public broadcaster or representing Canada, but those 12 people sitting in a room represent all. So I think, I can't even remember what your question was now, I'm so sorry. But
the shrapnel of colonization.
That's the shrapnel, is that
Right.
we're told over and over, thank you, that we don't belong, right? We're told that we don't belong in like many different ways every day, subtle or large. Yeah.
As you were speaking there, I was thinking of different experiences I've had in different newsrooms, print, radio, daily news, the demands of tomorrow, what's on the show tomorrow, but also on those occasions where we as journalists have done some of that work, and then I think of this interview often, but when there were more and more proof of systemic racism in Quebec, and specifically around the time where there was reports of forced sterilization of many Indigenous women, not just of one nation, not just in one region, across the entire province, of different ages. And I had to interview the Minister of Indigenous Affairs in Quebec, Ian Lafrenière. And I remember in that moment where I could not get a politician to admit that there was systemic racism in his province, and I still had to try, and then being told just that idea of like, even when you've done the work as a journalist, to have the facts to back you up, it's so often it's just like fighting, and it can be exhausting. And I didn't want to end on this question, but I'm realizing we're very close to the end. But I did want to talk about how open you've been about those difficult moments, those frustrating moments, being tired, being exhausted, being burnt out. And you did touch on some of the ways that wellness, that people you worked with on this book focused on wellness. How do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thinking what you were saying though, oh my God, that resonates. Like just needing like 5 white people to say racism happened. I remember I had a story about racism in a campground, and I mean, just why don't people want to speak up? Like, why is it so hard? There was a woman who was like, DM'd me, and she's like, just to let you know I was there and I witnessed the racism. I'm like, then why aren't you talking to me? Like supporting.
Why are you DMing that instead of tweeting it publicly?
Why aren't you talking to me on the record to support this black family who was kicked out of a campground and then was like left out on the street, like, and she was like, well, I don't want to rock the boat. And I'm like, it's your job. But yeah, for that story alone, they were like, well, I don't think you have enough. I don't see how it's really racism. And I'm like, you had the people who were running the campground also, like you had everyone saying, and they're like, I don't really see it. And so it's just like so frustrating. It's like gaslight nation, right? I always say like we live in a gaslight nation where it's just like we're not believed. And we're telling things that are like clear as day, plain as day all around us, but people just don't want to call it what it is. And I always talk about that. I did a keynote for the police like a few days ago, and they actually loved my talk. I was shocked. But it was just like, step one, admit that there's a problem. Admit that you have systemic racism. Like, why can't we admit that in Canada? Like, I'm the first one to say, like, I have, like, internalized bias, unconscious bias about Indigenous people as well. But we're not going to overcome these obstacles until we start with that day one. So speaking of, like, self-care, when I used to be going off on Twitter all the time, that was, like, my excuse. I'm like...
I loved those, by the way. Hearting
Everybody did. I feel like I was, like, Twitter famous for a while.
You were, definitely.
But now I'm kind of off of there, but... I was like, speaking out is a form of self-care, and it is, because it's like, the streams of people to come up behind you won't have to deal with this, hopefully, again. Like, we don't want another Angela Sterritt situation. I'm just kidding. But no, so when I started to I went on a sick leave from CBC for about 6 months. And it was kind of like physiotherapy for your brain. And so I was learning about mindfulness. I didn't know any of this stuff. And then once I started meditating and stuff, I was just like, oh, wow, I'm at like a really late, like I'm deep in my burnout, like so deep. But I was meditating at the end 2 hours a day. And just to try to relax my nervous system. And I try to take all of those new age processes or modalities and indigenize them, right? And realize, oh no, like this isn't a new age thing. Like Indigenous people gave thanks, did gratitude for time immemorial, right? We meditated all the time by the river, in the forest, in nature, but also like to hear what our ancestors were saying, right? So all of these things we did all the time. And so, yeah, it's leaving CBC, my nervous system, I'm like a different person. People are like, you look different, you seem different. I think that was taking care of myself. That was preventing the burnout. In terms of this book, it's like I had very serious PTSD at CBC, mostly from the racism, and I was just a nervous wreck all the time. So yeah, it was a lot of meditating, a lot of time in nature, a lot of counselors, coaches. I think I have like 5 still, counselors and coaches and guides and spiritual healers, Reiki, everything. I do it all. Like, and I'm lucky because you don't make money off books. I don't know if people know that.
Especially not in Canada, but I think almost everyone in this room knows that, people who've been to this festival year after year. And, but at the same time, we're so lucky that you choose to share this story and that you wrote it and worked so hard to bring this to life. And I'm really glad we got the chance to talk about it, Angela. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much. This has been one of the best conversations I've had. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.